Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of March 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll look at the latest on President Trump's tariffs. We'll hear about a California father's ambulance bill that doubled after it was learned he had insurance. And amidst economic turbulence here in the United States, we'll discuss the latest on the federal budget. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With this week's developments on President Trump's tariffs, it's our Dan McCaleb.
The roller coaster ride that is President Donald Trump's ongoing trade disputes with Canada and the European Union continued this week, with the province of Ontario, Canada, backing off its threats to impose 25% tariffs on U.S.-bound electricity after Trump threatened to double tariffs on Canada. And Trump also said this week he would impose 200% tariffs on European wine and spirits, in retaliation to the tariffs on U.S. alcohol. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, our colleague Brett Rowland has been covering the ongoing tariff battles, and I think he's getting really dizzy over it. Tell us more.
Yeah, I think Brett wanted to cover this because it's an important issue. It impacts average taxpayers, which of course is our angle here at the centersquare.com. I'll say that and it will have an impact on taxpayers, though how much remains to be seen. It's going to shake out in the details, but it's been a kind of a dizzying beat, Dan, because as you kind of alluded to, there's changes almost every day on the tariffs. Now, I think for, American CEOs and for people watching the stock market closely, it's kind of disconcerting. It's worrying to some free market libertarians. It's very concerning because, free trade is basically a theological tenet for many of them, and maybe rightly so, maybe not. But what we're seeing here from Trump is a couple of things. First, Trump is the America First president. I shouldn't have to say that, but I think it's worth saying in this context, because if you're thinking of this purely as economic policy, you're not seeing it from Trump's perspective. You got to remember that Trump has been running for years on how other countries are taking advantage of the U.S. How China is manipulating their currency and doing other different things to take advantage of the U.S., exploiting tax loopholes, which we've also covered at the centersquare.com. For instance, NATO is not paying their fair share of the defense budget. And, Trump even alluded to how Canada doesn't spend any money on defense. They spend like $27 billion a year, I think. But compared to the U.S., that's not very much. They don't spend any on defense, Trump said, because they expect the U.S. to pay for their defense. And so you have to see this tariff issue as part of the broader America First. Other countries are taking advantage of us. And so I think Trump is really resetting the global order. What other countries can expect from us, how much they can expect to benefit from our niceness, our kindness, really, because we are very kind to the world. Even without U.S. aid, we're very kind to the world. He's right that many countries are able to invest in their social services and not pay for defense because they're counting on the U.S. And also many of these countries do impose tariffs on us. China has had, different tariffs on us. Random countries, Bermuda has tariffs on us. A lot of people have had tariffs on us before Trump took office. And so there is a lot of chaos here. I think there's reason to be concerned. But when you look at it from the America First perspective, he's resetting the global order. So that's the first thing. And I'll toss it back to you after this, Dan. But, the second is the negotiating tactic. at first, this really seemed to be about getting the things that Trump wanted from other countries like Mexico and Canada protecting the border. But now that it's extended to the EU, I'm not so sure that it's just negotiating tactics anymore. I think we're more in the retaliatory tariff phase, which is where Trump's saying, if you're going to tariff us, we're going to tariff you. And he wants the tariffs to be fair as he sees fair.
Yeah, and it is important to note that President Trump says he's playing a game is not the right term, but this is a long-term negotiation tactic to balance the playing field, so to speak. But it is having real-world effects in the moment. You mentioned the stock market. We've seen some declines in the stock market since these trade battles have been going on. Ontario's threat, but later retracted to impose 25% tariffs on energy exports to the United States would have had an impact on consumers, particularly in states of Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, who do import some of their electricity from Canada. Heating bill prices would be going up. Other energy prices would be going up for them. Now, they're not going to, but again, and this changes on a daily basis. Let's switch focus to the Trump's threats this week to impose tariffs on European wine and spirit imports. He says, and this is true, that this is in retaliation or response to the European Union's long-held tariffs on American spirits exported to Europe. So, there should be some fairness here, right?
Yeah, I think the most Americans didn't even know these tariffs existed. They, Egypt has tariffs on us over 10%, Morocco, Thailand, Brazil, Pakistan, India, Belize, Ethiopia. There's more and more. You mentioned the tariffs on spirits. So I think it's not as if the whole world was just having perfect free trade and then Trump got elected and invented tariffs. This has been going on for a long time. President Joe Biden, he implemented some tariffs. And so I think there's a little bit of hysteria in the media in reaction to this for what Trump's doing. If it stays very targeted, we're only going to have tariffs on specific types of alcohol and the tariffs are going to be negotiated over time. I think that the average American consumer is not going to see a big change because of that. If we get entire sweeping tariffs against, everything that comes into certain and out of certain economies, that it will raise prices for Americans. So I will say, Dan, Trump initiated these, tariffs against China. He started at 10% and raised it up to 20% upon taking office. And of course, you know how much stuff we import from China. It's huge. And he also increased the taxes by removing a tax loophole that China was using to ship goods over here. So he increased the tariffs and the taxes on Chinese goods being shipped here. And in February, inflation decreased. It did not go up. So I don't know. It's hard to know. All the standard conventional wisdom is this will definitely increase prices. But so far, it seems it'll be more complicated than that because the February inflation data looked very good.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on an ambulance bill that doubled after the provider found out the patient was insured, it's our Dave Mason in California.
Kennedy had an interesting story this week about a California father who became shocked when his bill for an ambulance doubled for his daughter. I noticed that the dad had a troubling phone call. What happened?
Yeah, unfortunately, this California father's bill for his ambulance ride doubled after he provided his insurance coverage instead of actually going down, which he would have expected. And this is because of a new state law that he says punishes him for having coverage. So I'd like to actually share some of what was said in this conversation between social media star and father Robbie Witt and his call with the billing department for the ambulance. So Robbie was initially billed $603.34 because the ambulance company assumed that he was an uninsured patient. So wanting to cut down that $603 bill, he submitted his insurance details. But unfortunately, his bill actually doubled when he did so to $1,263.29. So naturally, he called the company to see what was going on. So the billing department representative told him the first invoice he received reflects the discount that one gets for being uninsured. And that after submitting the bill to his insurance, that his insurance only covered about $1,100 of the $2,400 bill. So when Witt asked if he can get a discount, if he canceled his insurance, he was told that because he had active coverage on the date of service, that he couldn't get the discount back by canceling his coverage now. The father, Robbie, said, "So I'll get cheaper health care if I'm uninsured. I pay for insurance and I end up paying more out of pocket because I pay for a premium. That's wild." The billing department's representative then said that a California law is actually responsible for this because AB 716 requires that uninsured patients receive this discounted rate.
So I think the father had an interesting suggestion then to the customer service representative. What was that suggestion?
What he did ask was if he wants to pay less for medical care, if he should just cancel his insurance. To which the representative said he doesn't really know because that's not really his domain. Let's actually look more, though, into AB 716. It requires that uninsured patients be billed the same low ambulance rate as whichever is the greater of what's charged to the taxpayer-funded Medi-Cal or Medicare programs. These are publicly funded healthcare programs. Medi-Cal is for lower income individuals. Medicare is for older individuals. So the fact that his initial bill was really low it reflects this discount rate that's required for uninsured patients. They get the same cost as the taxpayer-funded program. The bill does also require that out-of-pocket costs for insured patients using ambulances is the same for the patient, whether the ambulance provider is in-network or out-of-network. So the fact that Robbie's bill doubled after submitting his insurance does show that he has a very high cost sharing plan. So he probably is having lower premiums in exchange for higher cost sharing. So it's more of a catastrophic coverage type plan. But this doesn't really seem fair to Robbie, right? Because instead of using either taxpayer funded insurance, having no insurance, he's trying to save money. So he's just choosing a less expensive insurance option. But in addition to paying taxes and paying for these premiums, he's now having to pay a much, much higher rate because of what his coverage offers. And it's especially high compared to what happens if you don't have any insurance or are on a taxpayer funded program. So this really doesn't seem fair to the average Californian.
I know he posted his telephone call with that video on social media. What's been some of the reaction to what he went through?
People are really shocked at what happened, but they're not surprised that it happened in California. This is a state where healthcare benefits and priorities go to two, very different groups of people. It really does seem to provide the most benefits to either the very wealthy or the very poor. The state recently eliminated means testing for assets for getting taxpayer-funded long-term care. This really impacts disabled individuals and older individuals for this very expensive long-term care. But by eliminating the asset testing, this means that some people who have very high net worths but no income because they don't work anymore are able to get taxpayer-funded long-term care, which, as I said, is usually quite expensive because it can be very intensive and it could even be around the clock. The other beneficiaries of California's plan are people who are often uninsured or are at the income threshold to qualify for the taxpayer-financed Medi-Cal program. We've seen this happen with the recent system requiring a $3.4 billion loan after spending $9.5 billion this year on healthcare for undocumented immigrants.
Have you heard about any pushback in the legislature? Will there be any attempts, you think, to modify the Assembly bill on insurance?
I haven't seen anything regarding this specific law. What I can say is that there could be some federal legislation that does limit how the state can use its federal funding or whether or not it can even get the right kind of federal funding depending on what it spends its money on. but those bills have not moved forward yet.
Well, thanks for your time, Kenneth. I appreciate that. And that wraps up our report. You can find out more news from thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dave and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the federal budget, it's Dan McCaleb.
It's important to note that we are recording this on Friday, March 14th, before the U.S. Senate has had a chance to vote on a continuing resolution that would keep the government open. If the Senate does not vote to pass the GOP House bill, the government could shut down at midnight tonight. But there are indications that the Senate will vote to support the resolution, send it to President Donald Trump's desk, who has said he would sign it, after Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer yesterday said he will now support the measure to keep the government open. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, there's still a little bit of uncertainty about it, but now that the top Democrat in the U.S. Senate has put his vote behind it, it sounds like it'll pass today and Trump will sign it and we'll avoid a shutdown.
That's right, Dan. I've never seen Democrats in more division and disarray than since this Trump election. The first time around when Trump was elected, it was uniting for the Democratic Party. They had a common enemy to fight, and there were many Republican defections to empower them, embolden them, give them some moral authority. This time around, they have nothing of the kind. Democrats are divided. They're angry at one another. They have no clear vision. I've really never seen anything like it since I've been in journalism. And, you know, we saw that on display with the spending bill. So we were in danger of a government shutdown. I mean, truly, the closest we've been in a while. And earlier this week, you know, House Democrats were united. They were vocal in opposing this bill, this continuing resolution. You saw real unity and opposition within the Democratic Party in the House saying we don't like this bill. And then what happens? Just within 48 hours, the leader of the Senate Democrats says, oh yeah, I guess we'll probably vote for it. And now you're seeing outrage. You're seeing outrage from Democrats in the Senate who are frustrated with Chuck Schumer. And you're seeing a lot of frustration from House Democrats who just, you know, took this big public stand against this very bill. They're calling it a slap in the face. You know, AOC Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that there's, you know, a deep sense of outrage and betrayal in the Democratic Party. So there's really two stories here, Dan. One is the CR, which is going to, you know, buy Republicans some time through September, very marginal cuts. Trump says he wants a big, beautiful bill. And to buy some time for that. We'll see if they ever get that big, beautiful bill. So there's that first story. And the second story is that Democrats right now are in a tailspin. They're divided, even publicly fighting in the media with one another. Some of the biggest leaders in the party, Chuck Schumer and AOC.
Yeah, and there's the current dispute, of course, has been ongoing for years and years and years. Congress passing these continuing resolutions, which are essentially keeping past budgets that have been passed as the status quo, so they don't have to do the hard work and dig in to work out new budget, new spending plans, something that Trump wants after this current fiscal year ends. Trump and Republicans in Congress wanted this continuing resolution to go through the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. Democrats wanted a shorter continuing resolution, 30 days, which would mean we'd just be back here again next month doing the same thing. The Republican bill will keep the government funded, mostly status quo, although there are some changes in the continuing resolution through September 30th, and it now looks like the Senate will vote to do that. Republicans, who hold a very slim majority in the U.S. Senate, need 8 Democratic votes to keep it going. Pennsylvania's junior U.S. Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat, up until Schumer yesterday, he was the only Democrat that said he would support it. Now that the Senate Minority Leader, the top Democrat in the Senate, says he will vote for it as well, it likely means more Democrats are going to fall in line and they'll get the 8 votes they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really a way to give Democrats cover. Schumer comes out. He says, all right, guys. He knows that many Democrats will still vote against it, but it's really a signal that to the moderate Democrats to not shut down the government. The parties often do this where the party as a whole agrees to pass a bill, but the hardline and more extreme members of that party, whether it's Republican or Democrat, basically have permission to vote against it as long as they get enough votes to vote for it. And so that's probably what Schumer's doing here. He's signaling and telling the moderate Democrats who do not want to be blamed for a government shutdown, hey guys, we're voting for this. Whereas the more extreme progressive liberals like AOC can take a stand, die on this hill. Although I'll say it's not entirely performative. I think AOC and others are very frustrated with their own party. We saw that frustration even with the last election. They felt that, the way Kamala was kind of shoved on the party with no primary was frustrating for people. The way that the Kamala Harris campaign just wasted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Just spin it. I mean, it was kind of incredible when you see how they spent that money and wasted it. All the donor money was wasted. And now you see that there's no clear message against Trump. You see Governor Newsom, California governor, coming out and saying he doesn't agree with transgender athletes in sports suddenly, which is kind of incredible because he's been one of the leaders for Democrats on that issue. And it seems like he's running for president already and changing his positions. I think many Americans see through that, but who knows? He's a pretty smooth guy. So the Democrats are fighting each other to disarray. September, we're going to have another big funding battle. But Dan, I am a little pessimistic. I'm not sure we're going to get that big, beautiful bill. It may just be another CR to get through the election and more of the status quo here in Washington.
Well, Casey, that's how it's been done for years now. Why would things change now? But it's important for Congress to do the hard work that's necessary. Of course, since Trump's inauguration as president, he created the new Department of Government Efficiency, which has been tasked with identifying waste and fraud in federal spending. By the time we get to September, when a new budget needs to be passed or another continuing resolution, DOJ will have had months to dig in and find this waste. They've got time to put a reasonable budget that does not have deficit spending in it. And that's something that I think most Americans want them to do.
Well, they've got the time, but I don't think they have the political willpower because, DOJ, you're right. DOJ is going to come up with a lot more cuts, but they're not going to get us to a deficit-free bill without cutting entitlements. It's just not going to happen. So do Republicans have the political will, exactly 1 year out from the midterm elections to vote for something that's going to cut Medicaid drastically enough to get down to no deficit? I doubt it. Now, they could get the deficit back under $1 trillion probably without making deep cuts, basically return us back to the pre-COVID spending levels, which was, when our deficits never topped $1 trillion. Now, the CBO's projected our budget this fiscal year is on track to be over $2 trillion. So they could cut the deficit in half. I think that would be a pretty amazing series of cuts. It would be a win for them to say we cut the deficit in half, and they'd probably be able to do that without making really deep cuts into the entitlements, into defense spending. But if you're going to get down to no deficit, you're going to have to make some cuts that really, really hurt and cost some people some seats. And right now, I'm not sure Republicans are willing to do that. And Democrats aren't either, by the way.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Did Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's office delete emails related to a sexual misconduct complaint? Are workforce cuts coming to the Department of Education? And how could tariffs impact inflation? All of that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Lower energy prices drove down inflation in February, according to new federal data released this week. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics released that data Wednesday, showing inflation rose just 0.2% last month, part of a 2.8% rise over the past year. The average annual inflation rate from January's data was 3%, so overall inflation dropped in February. The decrease was partially driven by a decline in energy prices, a key promise of President Donald Trump's campaign. A coalition of 38 attorneys general in the Department of Justice proposed a final package of remedies to end Google's monopoly over internet search engines, The remedies would include requiring Google to divest Chrome as well as potentially other assets such as Android if the initial remedies fail to, quote, address the marketplace harms or if Google undermined the effectiveness of the decree, end quote. The proposal comes after a federal judge in the District of Columbia ruled in a landmark decision last year that Google is a monopolist in online search. Google says it plans to appeal last year's ruling after a hearing on the proposed remedies, which is scheduled to begin April 21st and conclude by May 9th. The Trump administration is ratcheting up pressure on New York's Columbia University as it seeks to identify participants in anti-Israel demonstrations for possible deportation. Last weekend, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrested and detained Mahmoud Khalil, a legal U.S. resident and Palestinian activist who led protests at Columbia last year. He is facing deportation and appeared before a federal immigration judge on Tuesday. President Donald Trump has vowed to arrest more demonstrators, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt blasted Columbia University for not helping the Department of Homeland Security identify individuals on campus who participated in pro-Hamas activity. The National Transportation Safety Board is urgently recommending that the Federal Aviation Administration permanently prohibit helicopter air traffic during certain times around Ronald Reagan National Airport in response to January's mid-air collision involving a passenger jet and a military helicopter. Echoing similar orders from the Department of Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy after the collision, the Safety Board is recommending that helicopter operations cease when specific runways are in use, underscoring that they pose a particular threat to aviation security by increasing the likelihood of a mid-air collision. In the first 5 months of this fiscal year, the U.S. federal government has already racked up $1.1 trillion in debt, or nearly $8 billion of debt per day. That's according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The fiscal year began last October and runs through the end of this September. Interest on the national debt now exceeds federal defense spending and is on track to be the largest expense for U.S. taxpayers. The Congressional Budget Office said the current deficit is $319 billion higher than the same time period for the previous fiscal year, and that even though revenues rose 2%, spending rose 13%. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more out of Pennsylvania, it's Christina Lingell.
And with me today is Pennsylvania editor Kristen Smith. Today, we're going to be talking about a situation in the Shapiro administration featuring deleted emails. So basically, the story is that one of his cabinet members was accused of sexual harassment, and now emails relevant to that situation are no longer available. Kristen, can you elaborate?
Yeah, it's been a tough week for Shapiro. He has been dealing with this scandal on and off for over almost 2 years now, but the latest came in actually a court hearing about a right to know request, which is just a public records request. And a reporter over at Broad and Liberty has been trying to get emails from the person who made the complaint. And they've been back and forth in court for years over this. And finally, at oral arguments on February 12th, a lawyer for the administration actually stood up in court and said, yeah, it's not that the emails you want didn't exist. It's just that we deleted them because they weren't necessary anymore, which, if you can imagine just how much of a stunning revelation that is, considering the fact that the government has specific timelines for how long they have to keep your emails, and it's anywhere from 3 to 8 years. And this person resigned 2 years ago. So there is no world in which they're in the right. And it's even more surprising that they went into a court of law and said this. I spoke with one of the attorneys who was working with the reporter on the right to know request, and he said he was dumbfounded and that it kind of changed the entire trajectory of what they were going to do, because now instead of just trying to get these emails, they're going to file sanctions or ask for sanctions against the Shapiro administration for obviously breaking these records retention law.
What is Shapiro's relationship to the person who was accused? Does he have a direct hand in what's happening?
So they, by all accounts, have a pretty chummy relationship, or at least they did until this happened. So the cabinet official was Mike Verb. He was the Secretary of Legislative Affairs right when Shapiro came into office in 2023. And they've known each other for decades. They were in the House of Representatives together. They were in the Attorney General's office together. And he's obviously working for him in his cabinet. And so he was accused of making inappropriate conduct or inappropriate comments to a deputy staffer. And he would retaliate when that staffer brought up those complaints to HR and to other voices. And all of this information kind of came out after the fact, because Verb resigned from his position quite suddenly about a few weeks before this major taxpayer funded settlement became public of $295,000. And at that time, it started to kind of come out why he resigned and how long this had been going on. And that was a 6-month period in between the complaint and when he actually resigned. And we're supposed to believe that Shapiro didn't know anything about it until right before the settlement. And that's what he's maintained publicly, that he's like, I didn't know what he was doing. You know, when I found out, I was, very on board with him stepping down. He's out of the administration now. So what does it matter? And I'm paraphrasing there. He wasn't that quite cold, but that was kind of how it came off. So he has maintained that position, but he's gotten a lot of flack for it, because obviously it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the governor of the state doesn't know what his top secretaries are doing and doesn't know when they've been accused of sexual misconduct. I mean, like I said, 6-month period from when it was brought to the attention to when he resigned. And so the idea that he had no inclination is really hard for a lot of people to accept, not just his critics. And that's why this particular reporter started to go deeper into the story and try to find out who knew what, when, and for how long. And the problem is we will never know, because these emails that would have shed light on the situation, they're gone. At least the government is saying we can't retrieve them because we deleted them. I'm no tech whiz, so I don't know what kind of magic can be done in order to bring them back. But at this point, if they do bring them back, they're kind of in a sticky situation because they said they couldn't get them. It's a big misstep for the administration this week.
So how are other people reacting to it? Is it going to impact his ability to govern and interact with other legislators at the state level?
So he's already kind of has a frosty relationship with Senate Republicans. And that's a pretty key relationship for him, because they are such a big part of negotiating legislation and budgets. Because if you don't have their support, you don't get a bill to his desk. And that relationship has been bad for a while. It's not getting any better. Part of the reason that it's not great is because the leader of the Senate, Kim Ward, she's been calling him out for this sexual misconduct complaint since it happened, and saying he knew, and he didn't say anything. And he waited 6 months to fire Mike Verb. And of course, again, Shapiro has denied this. And so again, she's coming out to say, the culture starts at the top. It doesn't matter if he wasn't directly involved. It's his job to set the tone for the administration. And this is a bad tone that was set. And she's putting a very nefarious spin on what the administration did, saying they did this on purpose. They were trying to hide things. Now, we have no idea why they did it. You could certainly say, if you look at it from that perspective, yeah, they might have, or it might have been an accident. Someone may have not realized you were supposed to keep them for a certain amount of time. Maybe they thought, oh, this person doesn't work here anymore. It is no longer relevant to keep their emails, in which case it's a big mess up, and it's not as nefarious as, say, deleting them to hide something. Either way, you've got a problem. You've got incompetency or you've got maliciousness. And I wouldn't want to have to pick either one of those if I were the governor. A lot of officials in these high-ranking positions, when stuff like this happens, I think they kind of just hope it fades into memory, that people forget about it. People hadn't really talked much about the sexual assault misconduct complaint until recently, until this information came out about the court hearing and how they admitted to deleting these emails. So when I talked to Shapiro's administration, or at least tried to talk to them, they did not offer additional comment. Shapiro was at a press conference the same day this court transcript came out, and he said that he wasn't aware of the reporting that had been done on it from Broad and Liberty, but that he is confident that his administration handles records retention policies as they are intended to do. So that's where he's at. He hasn't said anything more on it since.
Well, thanks, Kristen. We'll keep up with this at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Christina and Kristen. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on cuts to the Education Department's workforce, it's Therese Boudreau.
As part of President Donald Trump's plan to shutter the Department of Education, nearly half of the department's workforce will be cut, according to an announcement made Tuesday. Joining me to dig deeper into this story is reporter for the Center Square, Brett Rowland. So, Brett, Education Secretary Linda McMahon said the move is part of the department's final mission, insinuating that the closing of the Department of Education is near. What is the Trump administration's reasoning behind the move?
I think every Republican administration since Reagan has wanted to get rid of the Department of Education. Trump seems to be the first one that's actually taking strides to do that. We'll see how successful that will be, in the coming months and years. But my guess is that this is the start of a long process. The Education Department is actually a fairly small government agency with only about 4,100 employees, and about half of those are gone starting later this month. So we'll start to see that happen here pretty quickly.
And how would downsizing the department's workforce, as what just happened, how would that impact the Education Department's work, according to both McMahon and then also to other concerned parties?
So the Trump administration, including McMahon, wants to return education decisions to the state level, saying that state and local governments are in the best position to determine what their students need in terms of education. But there are national unions that have opposed this, including the National Education Association, which is the largest union in the United States. That union, President Becky Pringle said yesterday that essentially gutting the Department of Education will lead to higher class sizes, cuts in education, and make it education more expensive for middle class families. So there's a lot of conflicting information here. Trump thinks that education will continue on as it has in the past, just done at the state level. And unions in particular are concerned that these cuts could, essentially what they're saying is destroy education in the United States.
And given the department's, involvement, as you were saying, what about specifically in regard to Title IX and Pell Grants and student loans, in terms of if the department is fully abolished? What are people saying about that?
Well, so there's a couple different schools of thought here. One is that there are other agencies within the federal government that have a lot of experience doing things like loans and investigating civil rights abuses, including like the DOJ, the Small Business Administration for the loans. So there are other federal agencies that could take over these responsibilities for the Department of Education should it be eliminated. But my guess is that there would be at least some difficulty in transitioning those. Oftentimes we see that when we get down to, sort of the base level, sometimes these computer systems between agencies don't interact well. Sometimes entirely new workarounds need to be created. So there could be a lot of logistical hurdles here too, in addition to just, getting rid of the department, if that's in fact the plan. So there are other agencies that could take over the roles, what Trump sees as the important roles of the department, including, the Title IX enforcement could be handed off to DOJ. The loans could go to SBA or another agency that has a lot of experience with lending money and grants. And there are several. So there's some options there, but, I think that they're likely going to prove more challenging than, people might expect.
So what does the scale of those cuts look like as of right now?
That's a great question. So when Trump took office in January, the Department of Education had about 4,133 workers. So after Tuesday's announcement, the department's workforce will be about 2,183 workers. Included in that reduction in force are nearly 600 employees who took voluntary resignation opportunities. So that was 259 employees accepted the deferred resignation program, which was referred to often as a buyout in the media. And then another 313 employees accepted a voluntary separation incentive pay. And that was from the department specifically. So that really about cuts the department's workforce in half, which is a staggering amount of people given the size of the department and its role in education. But as we talked about before, some of those duties may be shifted to other agencies that may have staffing or the ability to handle those tasks. I've also heard that there's quite a bit of backlash to this. What's happening today? Have you heard anything about how people are reacting to the cuts?
Well, as you were saying, with just different unions reacting, I mean, all teachers' unions are very opposed to this. Especially many advocates are concerned about how student loans will be managed. Like you said, there could be other departments that take those up, but the transition will be difficult. And the managing of student loans, of course, has been a problem for decades. Currently, there's roughly $1 trillion in outstanding student loans in FAFSA, so loans that haven't been paid yet. So it all fits, I think, into this larger picture of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that the Trump administration is pursuing, where they say that they're trying to cut bureaucratic bloat. But the real question is, and what people are pushing back against, these education advocates, they're saying, how are you going to facilitate this? I mean, they're completely against it anyway, but that's the main question. How is this all going to work? How are students going to pay their loans back? What is the organization going to look like? And it doesn't seem like the Trump administration has many answers to those questions yet.
My guess is that those will start coming in the coming weeks, or months, depending on how long this process takes. But my guess, just personally, is that it's going to be a long one.
Thank you, Therese and Brett. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss tariffs and their potential impacts on inflation is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, I want to talk about tariffs. We also want to talk about the Federal Reserve, but talk to me. What are you thinking here, man?
Yeah, I mean, look, my thoughts are we really don't want anything that could potentially cause prices to increase. You could get away with maybe a one-time price bump. I don't know if you can get away with retaliation and multiple price bumps. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, when consumers begin to expect that prices are going to be higher, they can either substitute for cheaper goods, right? If they find them, or essentially their expectations, price growth expectations change, right? Inflation expectations change. And if people begin to suspect that prices will be higher in the future, what do? Well, they go and spend today. They spend a lot. And that actually causes prices to increase rapidly. And it becomes kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism where you end up with actual, higher inflation pressures. And so that's not what we want. I think that's what the Fed will be watching for. Mm-hmm. You're right. Changes in inflation expectations, is going to be what the Fed will be watching for. The other thing is, you also don't want essentially the price increases to cause, the policy uncertainty to cause businesses to pause on, investment and hiring decisions. Because if that happens collectively, you get less economic growth. You get less, fewer job gains.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think, the administration, certainly has come out of the box hot. President Trump, he addressed Congress, I believe it was on Tuesday night this week. Markets have been, simply bonkers and not in a good way. That the instrumentation that the president is trying to execute at this time is he's pulling a lot of levers, and he's pulling a lot of levers at the same time, and sort of like the tariffs to Mexico. Like, it did not get a lot of run. The story did not go as wide as, as the headlines on tariffs at the beginning, that Trump pulled back on some tariffs to Mexico, categories of products to Canada and Mexico this week. I mean, do you think that this is maybe just a blip, that as these policies are basically being laid in, that you have overreactivity to what's occurring? Is it? I mean,
look, the markets always overreact one way or the other.
Right. That's why I asked the question. I mean, it's like, hey, do you remember about a month ago we were talking about the future of AI, and what was the Chinese AI? Was it DeepSeek? And all of a sudden it's like, holy cow, this is going to flip AI on its head. Well, it didn't. All right. It didn't. It temporarily caused, if you're holding NVIDIA, you're paying attention to the market that week, but then NVIDIA started to come back. Now, all stocks, in particular tech, in the last week really has, caught a shot to the chops. It's not been a good week, if you're a tech investor. But is it possible that we're just in this, that the market just doesn't get it yet, or doesn't see this sort of the same vision that the administration sees? Interpret it for me to whatever degree you feel like you can.
Well, I mean, look, I watched the new Treasury Secretary on CNBC this morning, and he said, hey, the tariffs tend to hurt the country with the surplus more than the country with the deficit. I don't know. I think we have a view as economists to think, that basically suggests that, less trade is actually bad for everyone. And so I guess we're going to have to find out if the decades and decades of economic research, prove to be wrong in this instance. But ultimately, I think when people know what they're dealing with, tariff or no tariffs, actually much better than not knowing how to prepare for the future. And so I think the policy uncertainty is a bigger problem for businesses
than the actual policy.
Than the actual policy. The fact that no one knows what's going to happen next and how to plan for the future.
That's what I'm thinking. But as I'm, just thinking about sort of business as I know it, that there are periods of uncertainty in any business. And in this case, because you're talking about federal policy and that becomes international policy. So we just simply don't know. Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. Rowe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find great podcasts. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at the Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.